All right, John Wesley, born 1703, which makes him 10 years younger than George Whitefield, who we talked about last week. They were acquainted. They got acquainted at Oxford and maintained a cordial relationship in ministry throughout their careers. John Wesley was born into a family of 15 children, 9 of which survived. His father was Samuel Wesley. His father was a priest in the Anglican Church in England. And so John Wesley grew up in a family where religious practice was very much part of his entire experience. He was homeschooled, which was not, of course, unusual, especially if you had a scholarly parent, especially in classical education, meaning he learned classical languages. He was conversant and really quite competent with Greek, with Latin, other ancient languages, and also, of course, with contemporary languages, and was a very bright student, did very well, distinguished himself well, even in that homeschool situation. A kind of defining moment in his life appears to have been when he was 5 years old and narrowly escaped from a house fire. He could very easily have been caught in the fire and actually lost his life there, but just through a kind of close set of circumstances was able to kind of beat it out the back door. But all of the years subsequent to that, that remained a kind of searing memory in his mind, both literally and figuratively, you know. And it did seem to come back to him again and again as almost a vision of hell. This awful sight of the building going up around him and seeing himself trapped in it. And in some ways, some have thought that maybe the great rigor that he applied later in his life to the pursuit of holiness was in some way inspired by this early experience of having this house fire incident. So anyway, it may have some effect on his later career. He entered Oxford in his late teenage years at about the age of 17, at the age of 17, the year 1720, and completed his studies, distinguishing himself well there. He was ordained as a deacon in the Anglican Church in 1725. To be a deacon would be the first step toward full ordination, so this was kind of a step in the process of moving in that direction. He was distinguished at that time, and if you would have watched him, you would have noticed almost immediately about him that he pursued holiness in his life with a kind of harsh, rigorous, personal discipline. He was holding himself to a very high standard and made no bones about the fact that other people should be doing something like that. And so his life was very much one of close discipline and a great deal of sort of imposed control on his time and labors and so on, all through that period of time. In 1727, he stayed on, got his master's degree at Oxford, and he also was granted at this point what's called a fellowship. So he became a fellow, which means that at this point he was receiving a stipend and was also free now to continue his educational pursuits all the way through to the end, really, at Oxford, which he continued to do. He was also the following year ordained a priest in the Anglican Church, and that is a credential that he maintained throughout his life. So even though we think of John Wesley as founding the Methodist denomination, in England it didn't really happen until after his death. The Methodist Church as such really started in America as a result of Wesley's labors, but in England it was a Methodist movement that still remained broadly within the Anglican community. And so it's never a separate denomination, at least during his life. And he maintained his Anglican status throughout that period of time. Once he became a priest, he served as what's called a curate at Epworth. That's where his father was the minister, the priest, and this was something like being a sort of an assistant to him. So he served for 2 years with his father there, and then he returned to Oxford. He returned to Oxford because if he didn't, he would lose his fellowship. And he wanted to keep that intact, and so for practical reasons, he came back. By this time, the Holy Club was in operation. The Holy Club was actually started largely by his younger brother, Charles Wesley, famous for his hymn writing. I'd like to give a little more attention to Charles. I should, but I'm going to skip past him. He has a fascinating story of his own, but I'm going to focus more or less on John for our purposes this morning. But in any event, Charles, who was also given to a rather rigorous form of pursuit of holiness in his life, had been responsible, along with a few others, to start this club. They didn't call it the Holy Club, by the way. You know, that wasn't really a catchy title for a club. But no, they just had a fellowship, and in this fellowship they engaged in and sort of had a pact to pursue a certain course of life. When John came back in 1730, he basically took over as the leader then of the Holy Club. Some of the practices that characterized the Holy Club were that they met daily from 6 till 9 a.m. for prayer, for the singing of psalms, and of course for reading the New Testament in Greek, which of course we all should be doing, you know. And they practiced engaging in prayer at least for a few minutes of every hour of every day, the waking hours of the day, kind of like the Apostle Paul would say, pray without ceasing. They tried to do that, and that was part of their regimen. They took communion, of course, every Sunday. They fasted on Wednesdays and Fridays until 3 p.m. And so they had that part of their discipline as well. They also began with the return of John Wesley in 1730 to practice visiting prisoners in jail. John Wesley especially was impressed by the instruction from James in the New Testament that true religion is to visit widows and orphans in their distress, meaning provide for their practical needs as well as their spiritual and social needs, and also to visit prisoners. And so John Wesley especially took that as part of his call and really facilitated that with the others who were in this club. He was engaged by this time in preaching, in teaching, and he also began a ministry of raising money to meet the debt requirements of people who were in the debtor's prison. You know, at the time, somewhat counterintuitively, if a person was deep enough in debt, you throw them in jail. I don't know how they paid off their debts in jail, but that's where they wound up. And John Wesley did what he could to try to raise money and meet the debts, at least of those who he was able to do so, to free them from the debtor's prison. So he did that. He cared for the sick. He was a man filled with good works. In other words, if we were to see him in the year 1730, we would think there was one driving agenda that carried this man along, and that was to serve God and please Him and discipline his own life. And I think probably, I certainly, and I don't know, I'm guessing maybe some of us in this room might feel put to shame by the level of energy that he devoted to this kind of pursuit of virtue in his own life. And this is in 1730. At that time, there was an anonymous tract that was circulated around Oxford that called these guys who were in this group the Oxford Methodists. Again, the term was not intended necessarily in a complimentary fashion. It's not clear, but it was seems to have been a little bit critical of the idea that these guys were all about the method, you see, the methodology of their pursuit of holiness. And so that was a term that was coined at that point. But obviously John Wesley was not overly opposed to the use of that term, and eventually that indeed became the term that he used to describe the movement over which he was in some sense presiding. He traveled to America in 1735. Now recall George Whitefield, we talked about last week, came to America in 1738. So this is 3 years prior to Whitefield's journey. They were acquainted by this time. They were both at Oxford. George Whitefield is a student. John Wesley here in this kind of professorial role by this point. But Wesley felt that he was being called by God to go to America, to Georgia, which he did. And so he traveled across the lake, and in so doing, he came in contact with a group of Christian people called Moravians. Now, we've talked a little bit about the Moravians, but just to refresh your memory, the Moravians date back to the days of John Huss, or John Hus, probably should be pronounced. John Huss was a professor of theology at the University of Prague in what was then called Bohemia. He was distinguished for his expertise, but he was also deeply impressed by the writings of John Wycliffe. We had this conversation some months back. I'm just dusting off the cobwebs here a little bit, you know. Well, John Huss got in trouble with the Catholic authorities, and he was arrested and taken to Constance. And there, even though he was actually not arrested, he went with a guarantee of safe conduct, but once he received there, they reneged on the safe conduct and arrested him and threw him into a dungeon, requiring that he recant of his heretical teachings. The Council of Constance convened and was there mainly to resolve the problem of the Great Papal Schism, but one of the side issues they dealt with was John Huss. He refused to recant. He was burned at the stake. That inspired there in Bohemia and Moravia, which is in that region as well, a movement which was more or less inspired by Huss and his teachings. That movement continued, and indeed Martin Luther was originally called a Hussite because he was viewed as one who was following in that particular tradition. So these were people who were pre-Reformation in their time frame, but were really embracing a Reformation vision in their belief and thought, even though it was prior to Martin Luther. Well, they sustained themselves. They were persecuted severely through the years, but nevertheless maintained themselves as kind of an underground fellowship all through the years. In 1722, a large group of them migrated, escaped really, from Moravia to Saxony. And they came to be called the Moravians because they came from Moravia, you see. Now, this is only about 10 or 15 years later that a group of those people are in England on a boat to America, and it's these people that John Wesley now encounters. He was deeply impressed by the simplicity and purity of their heartfelt faith. He was impressed at the virtue characterizing their lives, but he was also impressed at how effortless it seemed to be. He felt that his life was always filled with kind of a harsh discipline and rigor that was constantly a battle, and yet these folks seemed in a kind of spontaneous joy to be accomplishing what for him had been such a hard and difficult task. So he was very drawn to them, and he did converse with them and had some opportunity to do so during their weeks at sea as they were coming to America. Anyway, he showed up here. He was hoping to inaugurate in Georgia the same kind of paradigm for worship as that which he had been responsible for, with some success, in England. Hard, rather rigorous discipline, a pursuit of holiness. He didn't get much traction in Georgia. In fact, he himself described it as a complete disaster. Nobody wanted to hear him preach. Nobody was really interested in the somewhat harsh circumstances of life in Georgia at that time. They weren't interested in adding on, you see, more discipline, more harsh requirements and rules and so on. And so after 2 years, he felt very despondent. He really felt that his entire call to the ministry was sort of called into question by the very limited success that he felt that he had had. And finally, he more or less, in despair, got back on a boat. So his 2 years in the United States, and I believe that's the only 2 years he was here, I may be mistaken, but I think that was the extent of his time in America. He goes back to England and he arrives in 1737, and again he's in contact with George Whitefield, of course, who was one of his friends there. It's at this time that he has what we called earlier and what he called the Aldersgate experience. The Aldersgate experience took place in a Moravian meeting. So he's back in England. These Moravians with whom he had felt some contact during the voyage now to him become a place of worship, and so just more or less experimenting, he shows up and begins attending meetings with these Moravians. And on one particular occasion as he was there, they were reading from Luther's commentary on the book of Galatians. Some people have suggested the finest literary production of the life of Martin Luther was when he wrote this commentary on the book of Galatians. And so if you're ever looking for something by Martin Luther that would be good reading, then you might want to take a look at that. It's very readable, and it really does reflect Luther at his energetic and somewhat sarcastic best, you know. And so anyway, they're reading from Luther, and John Wesley hears these words from Galatians and from Luther's writing on that, and this is when he made this comment in his own personal journal: "I felt my heart strangely warmed. Something happened, and it was a defining moment for John Wesley, as if, and we kind of track this from his own writings of his own experience, kind of track this as a moment when some new sense of call, some new sense of purpose in his ministry took over. He continued his life of rigorous discipline for sure, and that word Methodist continued to be apropos, but nevertheless now it seemed to have a new light and a new joy that was at the very heart of it. And so as Wesley himself described it, it was kind of his transforming moment, a moment when really his whole ministry was redefined. He continued to meet with the Moravians for some time, and wanted to absorb as much as he could the atmosphere and the kind of style of these people, though he still remained himself an Anglican. It was at this point that Whitefield had returned from America. So if you recall from last week, Whitefield went to America, went to Savannah, Georgia, was engaged in ministry, saw the needs of orphans especially, went back to England to do fundraising so he could go back to America and build an orphanage. That's all fresh in your minds. This is when Whitefield has just come back. He is also at this time preaching to the Kingswood miners, that is to say, people engaged in mining in Kingswood, Bristol. And after Whitefield had finished his time and was ready to go back, he said to his friend John Wesley, "You need to take over this ministry. You need to start preaching." The only problem for Wesley was Whitefield was preaching outside. Who could think of such a thing? And so John Wesley was somewhat reticent. And in fact, later he writes in his own journal of this, quote, "I could scarce reconcile myself to this strange way of preaching in the fields, of which Whitefield set me an example on Sunday. Having been all my life till very lately so tenacious of every point relating to decency and order," like a good Presbyterian, you know, "that I should have thought the saving of souls almost a sin if it had not been done in a church." You know, if you're going to get your soul saved, you better be in church. That was kind of Wesley's view of it. And so the idea of doing what Whitefield was encouraging and preaching in the open air in Kingswood and elsewhere was difficult, but nevertheless John Wesley acceded to that. And interestingly, for the next 50 years, that was the dominant venue where we find John Wesley preaching. He did preach here and there. He didn't have a normal kind of priestly ministry in the Anglican Church, but he was always a priest by his ordination. But he traveled around throughout the British Isles and elsewhere, preaching both in churches and outside of them in open-air gatherings, very much in the style of George Whitefield. He didn't have quite the level of energy, the same sort of almost miraculous powers of preaching that we find in Whitefield, but it was certainly a similar kind of expression of Christian ministry. He was welcomed at times in certain Anglican churches, but at times he was also refused admission. He was a controversial character. The main thing that made him controversial was this part of his message that went back to his own experience of being born again. That was really more or less the guiding light of his preaching, calling people to repentance, calling people to the new birth, urging them to embrace this moment of really having the eyes opened, you see. And that was not very much a significant part of Anglican ministry at that point. So he was controversial, but consistent and courageous and carried on. And in many ways, the Great Awakening in America, which had its parallel in England, was not only the work of Whitefield, but to some degree, and for many years hence, also the labors of John Wesley. So that was more or less his story, and it continued for some years to come. He founded in 1739 what's called the Methodist Society. It's not a church, not a denomination, but it was a kind of sub-fellowship under the broader heading of Anglican worship, although many nonconformists also participated as well. He never intended to compete with the Anglican Church. He was never trying to sort of set up a competing organization or church or any such thing, at least in England. And so that was really, at least to some degree, the story of John Wesley to that point. The story of the Methodists, I want to take separately here just for a minute. There was a heavy emphasis among the Methodists, largely from Wesley himself, on lay preachers. The Presbyterians were pretty interested in making sure people were well trained, well educated before they went out and engaged in ministry. Some people have said that the reason Presbyterians didn't get a more prominent role in the West was because while others were just sending them out, the Methodists, the Baptists, others were just sending folks out, the Presbyterians were keeping their people back to get PhDs in theology. And so we sort of were lately, Johnny-come-latelys, in some ways in this missionary effort. Although I don't want to overstate that, and next fall we're going to look at some of that a little bit more closely. But anyway, Wesley himself believed that people could understand the gospel, understand how to communicate it, even if they otherwise had somewhat limited training. And so he sent folks out as lay preachers, and that was part of what distinguished this Methodist movement in England and elsewhere. He also emphasized a kind of itinerant ministry. He didn't want pastors to land and sort of serve in one place for too long at a time. Wesley maintained that Anglican style of church governance, a sort of top-down, episcopal, authoritarian sort of approach. And so in the Methodist Church to this day, there are bishops, there's a kind of hierarchy, and pastors serve by appointment. We Presbyterians, as you know, call people. We have a congregational meeting. We hear a guy preach or a gal preach, and we, decide whether we're going to have this person come and be a minister here. We make a congregational decision. That's a little bit of the more kind of democratic side of Presbyterial governance. In the Methodist Church, it's by appointment. The bishop appoints you to a church, usually for a limited period of time, 5-7 years at the most, and then off you go to some other place. So it's a kind of a different way of doing it. This all goes back to Wesley. It goes back to his kind of Anglican view of church organization, that kind of thing. He himself, as I said earlier, never rejected his Anglican ordination. He ordained leaders, however, in America, which was not nearly as well formulated in its official ecclesiology as was England, really required that people who were preaching have some kind of sanction, and so it almost necessitated a kind of ordination process. And so really, interestingly, though Wesley was always English, the Methodist Church officially really started in America. It's an American phenomenon and began there. I want to steal a little bit of my thunder that I plan to cover more next fall, but just to plant this seed. There is in American history, the Great Awakening. We've talked about that, 1740s. There is what's sometimes called the Second Great Awakening. The first Great Awakening with Edwards and Whitefield was in a Calvinistic kind of theology. And I've tried to prove that to you the last couple of weeks. Both of those men were deeply committed to that classical Reformed understanding that you'd find in Calvin, that you'd find even in Luther, you'd find in Augustine, that view that God is sovereign in matters of salvation. The Second Great Awakening, which would be something more like the 1820s, 30s, 40s in America, was under an Arminian kind of vision. And it was largely inspired by Wesley and those who came after him, who were part of that more Arminian approach to theology and to Christian conversion. And so the Second Great Awakening inspired in American history what's sometimes called revivalism. The revivalist preachers really got underway at that time, and that's continued, of course, as you know, down through American history, that sort of revivalist approach to Christian ministry and to evangelism. The First Great Awakening was not revivalism in the sense that it eventually took shape under the influence really of this more Arminian vision. Revivalism was especially dominant in the kind of northeast states, New England and so on, and there were so many revivals that took place again and again that the nickname that was earned for northeast United States regions was the burned over district. You ever heard that? The burned over district, because there had been so many revivals. again and again, people had these revival fires, and eventually it just looked like a lot of stubble out there, sort of spiritually. And it's out of that some of the most interesting sort of offbeat religious movements were inspired, out of the burned-over district. For example, Joseph Smith grew up in Palmyra, New York, in the very midst of this burned-over revivalism, you see, and he, of course, founded Mormonism. The Millerite movement was also connected to this. Out of the Millerite movement came both the Seventh-day Adventists and also the Jehovah's Witnesses, to some degree, were connected to that particular movement. Even Mary Baker Eddy and the Christian Science movement a little later had some context to it. So my point is that this became kind of an interesting mix of religious experience and the revivalist mentality. I'm not blaming Wesley for this, by the way, don't get me wrong. I'm just kind of tracing some of the things that happened. This kind of revivalist approach, which functioned more as a spiritual life based on emotion rather than on, sort of theological thinking, heart rather than mind, if you will, in some sense, did give rise to some very interesting later expressions in American history. I hope to do more with that next fall, but I just want to kind of connect a couple of those dots with you. I'm not laying the blame for this with Wesley at all, so I like the guy and I want to be a cheerleader for him more than a critic of him, so don't take me wrong in those comments. But anyway, Wesleyan theology, I think, needs to be on the table with us, and I'd like to take at least what time we have left to try to look at this. I've used the term Arminian, and I know some of you are familiar with it, some of you may not be, but let's consider what's going on. Both Whitefield and Wesley were at Oxford together. As you know, Whitefield, really not long after his conversion, affirmed and embraced, and throughout his career was absolutely not apologetic for a very robust Calvinistic view of how Christian ministry proceeds. God is sovereign. He calls people. He calls them sovereignly. The agent of that call is the Christian preacher who's preaching faithfully the gospel, and it's up to God to reach those souls that he intends to reach and bring them to himself. That Calvinistic view, we've talked about that a little bit before. John Wesley differed with Whitefield. Clearly, in personal conversation and throughout their career, John Wesley followed and embraced what's called the Arminian tradition. Now, ever since the Reformation, ever since Luther and Calvin, there had been largely this kind of Augustinian emphasis. God is sovereign, predestination, God calls. We are called from death to life by his sovereign appeal to us, you see. That had been more or less the dominant theology. The Puritans were virtually all of them in the same kind of school of thought. This was more or less the only game in town, until a guy named Jacob Arminius. Jacob Arminius was a Dutch Calvinist. Holland, as you know, had been a place where people could escape religious persecution. And in Holland, there was a strong Calvinistic community there. They were called Dutch Reformed or Dutch Calvinists. And many of them reached that place because they were escaping persecution elsewhere. All right. Arminius grew up in that tradition. But he was also touched by a kind of leftovers of Renaissance humanism and found a conflict between what he liked in humanism and what he disliked in Calvinism, and he began to be involved in what was called a movement called the Remonstrants in Holland. Now, Arminius himself died at a fairly early age, but this movement continued. The Remonstrants were actually remonstrating against Calvinism in Holland. And they critiqued Calvinism at 5 strategic points. And this became something of a conflict, culminating in what's called the Synod of Dort, D-O-R-T, in 1619, in which the community of Calvinists there got together and considered the objections that had been raised by the Remonstrants. And it was, interestingly, out of that Synod of Dort that we hear for the first time of tulip. I don't know if this has anything to do with Holland, but if you've been around the block a few times, you've heard of the acronym related to tulip. And this is usually called the 5 points of Calvin. The irony is that the 5 points of Calvin are actually 5 points of response to the 5 points raised by the Remonstrants. It was actually the Remonstrants that first defined the 5 points of Calvin negatively, you see. By the way, Calvin never heard of the 5 points of Calvin. So I don't think he would dispute them. I don't think he would object to them. But some people get the feeling that that's all Calvin ever talked about. And in fact, if you read his Institutes, you'll find that his mind is ranging over many, many, many topics, very disparate topics of Christian teaching and criticizing those in his day and so on. And although he certainly addresses this, this is not by any means the dominant theme in his theological writings. But it certainly it's come to be called Calvinism, and I think it's probably fair, and I don't think Calvin would object to any of these points. So you have this acronym, TULIP, which represents now the affirmations of the Synod of Dort in response to the objections raised by the Remonstrants. I'm mentioning all this because, of course, Wesley embraced this Arminian view. And so for purposes of a short course in church history, we wouldn't be doing our job unless we at least mentioned TULIP at some point. And this is the point. So here we are. T is for total depravity. Total depravity is the teaching that goes clear back to Augustine, and I would say clear back to Paul, that we are dead in our trespasses and sins. Calvin never taught total depravity in the sense that we're always doing the most wicked possible thing we could do. If we were doing, at any given moment, the most wicked thing we would do, the human race would self-destruct in about 15 seconds. You know that. So we are being restrained from doing the most wicked thing we could do constantly by common grace, by enlightened self-interest, by all kinds of forces that are serving to restrain the evil wickedness within us, but it's always there as a potential. The point of this is to say we are completely infected by sin. There is no island of goodness within us that is exempted from the effects of sin and of corruption. It affects all of us, and at the most central point with which we all have to deal, our response to God, we are properly described biblically as being dead. Not sick, not weak, not on the brink of death. We're dead, you see. And Paul says in Ephesians chapter 2, and you were dead in your trespasses. Dead is kind of it doesn't allow for many degrees. You ever notice that? You're more or less either dead or you're not. And I know modern medicine is equivocating slightly on that, but we mostly have an idea. Paul is using a strong word to describe a category that doesn't allow for many variations or gradations. And so that's the idea. And so that's what's being taught here. And of course, if we are totally depraved, if we're dead, then we are never going to, on our own initiative, choose God. We are, as Paul says, God haters. Okay. The Arminian view was that we are almost dead. We are very, very sick. We are deeply, deeply close to being dead. And so, now I'm not trying to, I want to be even-handed. You know where I'm coming from. You do know that, don't you? But anyway, I want to be even-handed. Jacob Arminius said, we are deeply infected by sin, but we still have, this is his term, a potential for good. It's not strong enough that we can act on it. We don't have the power to actually do good. Arminius took that biblical teaching very seriously, but there's still kind of the potential. He said that there is something called prevenient grace. Prevenient grace comes to people prior to regeneration and meets them at that point of their potential to do good. And if they will cooperate, and that's the critical term, if they will cooperate with that grace, then they will be saved. Those who cooperate are saved. Those who do not cooperate are lost. And so it still winds up being a matter of human volition, ultimately, whether a person comes to faith or not. Ultimately, it's not God's choice, it's human choice, you see. So the total depravity was being challenged by the Remonstrants. They were trying to give as much credit to the biblical instruction as they could, but still leave a little bit of a window in there for human volition. And that was really the critical point. Out of total depravity flows the second point, unconditional election. The purpose of the word unconditional is to say there's no condition in us. There's nothing in any of us that would account for why God would choose one and not another. It's unconditional. Paul writes in Romans chapter 9, before the twins were born or had done anything good or bad, in order that God's purpose in election might stand, it was said to her, the older will serve the younger, just as it's written, Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. This is the kind of biblical material that gives rise to a Calvinistic vision that ultimately God's doing the choosing. That this is not ultimately an anthropocentric universe. It's a theocentric universe in which God happens to be running the show, you see. Well, the Arminians, again, didn't like that. And so they wanted to say that God's election is kind of an election of a class of people. And I can still opt in or opt out as I wish. I can elect myself to be elect, if you will. And so Arminius talked about election, or the elect, as a class of people rather than as individual people, still based on whether I make that choice in the inner sanctum of my potential for doing good in response to prevenient grace. The L stands for limited atonement. The idea here is that ultimately the atonement of Christ applies to those whom He has chosen. If the atonement of Christ in fact applied to everybody, everybody would wind up in heaven, because the atonement of Christ is an actual payment for your sins. It's certainly effective in the sense that it's adequate for the sins of everybody, but it only applies to those who are actually saved, and so it's limited in that sense. Many people don't like the word limited atonement because they don't like to limit the efficacy of the work of Christ, and I can appreciate that. Charles Spurgeon, the famous Baptist preacher of the 1800s in England, who was a strong Calvinist, preferred the term definite atonement. So, if you prefer that, then more power to you. But anyway, it's the same idea. The atonement of Christ is applied to those who indeed are the recipients of the grace that God gives in choosing them. Irresistible grace is the notion that God, once He has predestined a person, calls them. Paul says in Romans chapter 8, whom He predestined, those He also called. The call takes place at a moment in your life when, as Wesley would say, your heart is strangely warmed. It's interesting to me that I think Wesley's story is so Calvinistic, but he didn't ever see it that way, But anyway, he had that experience. Something happens. God calls you. He knew you from all eternity, but at a certain moment in time, His grace reaches you and changes, as Ezekiel says, a heart of stone into a heart of flesh. Something happens. And that God that we once hated, the God that, as Paul says in Romans 3, we would never seek because we all go out of the way, that God who we will run from as a fugitive, all of a sudden becomes irresistibly attractive to us, and we won't be kept from Him. Jesus says, every person the Father gives me will come to me. If God gives you to Christ, you will come to Christ. You won't be kept from Christ. He is irresistibly lovely to you, and nothing will keep you away. That's the sense of irresistible grace. And so it's the idea that the heart has changed. The heart has changed. And the God we once hated, we now love. Of course, Arminian view was that grace is resistible. You must cooperate with it, and it's still your choice whether to do that or not. Finally, perseverance of the saints. The idea is that since our salvation is a work of God's grace from start to finish, that when God calls you and brings you to Christ, you will never be chased off. Jesus says again, listen to these words, no man can come to me unless the Father draws him. The Greek word, by the way, there is helkeo. It's the same word that's used for drawing a sword or for drawing water out of a well. In any case, and it's also often used for the word drag. When it said that Paul and Silas were dragged off to prison, that's the word that's used, helkeo. No one can come to me, Jesus says, unless the Father drags him, brings him to Christ. And then Jesus says, whoever comes to me, I will in no wise cast out. And so the Calvinist view is that grace brings you and grace holds you. If grace were to release any of us, we would drop like a rock right now. It is grace that sustains us in our faith, and the perseverance of the saints is really just another tribute to the grace of God. I realize in this room it's very probable that we've got a mixed group here, some Calvinists, some Arminians. That's wonderful. I'm just trying to be pedagogical at the moment, but I hope this helps to at least clarify the issues. It's Wesley, more than Arminius, who gave traction to the Arminian vision. Arminianism sort of sustained itself for a while, but it was really Wesley who gave this a kind of new infusion of energy, and the Methodist tradition has generally followed that approach. A couple of other details about Wesleyan theology. He was really part of what has come to be called in Christian history the holiness tradition. The holiness tradition took seriously, as Wesley did, of course, the call to holiness and especially the disciplines involved in it. And the belief of Wesley was that you could reach a point of Christian sanctification, of some kind of perfection. For Wesley, he called it perfect love. He didn't teach sinless perfection. He did teach that it's possible in this pursuit of holiness to reach perfect love. Charles Wesley's famous hymn, "O Perfect Love," is a celebration of this theological tenet, even though it's often sung at, I was about to say funerals, I meant to say weddings. Honey, I didn't mean it. So you know what I'm saying there. So it's perfect love, that idea of a perfection of love. Now later holiness teachers did teach perfectionism. Sinless perfection. The two tend to come together. Arminianism, on the one hand, with its emphasis on the human will, tends to include in its package of teaching a potential for perfection. They tend to come together, and whereas the Reformed tradition has always repudiated that as preposterous, that we would ever reach sinless perfection in this life. We're always, with the Apostle Paul, pursuing the mark, pursuing it, but never achieving it finally and perfectly, of course. So he did have that, but it was a kind of limited perfection that you find there. He also, much to his credit, bravely supported in England abolition, which was, of course, being championed by his contemporary, William Wilberforce, and also John Newton, who we'll look at next week, the slave trader turned Christian preacher who wrote Amazing Grace. So these were points where he was an active social participant in life there in England as well. So as I say, next week we're going to take a look at John Newton. Just to return to this thought, this text from Jesus and his conversation with Nicodemus. In case you hadn't detected, I'm a Calvinist. I'll just admit it to you. I'm a Calvinist. I'm a Calvinist. That's why I'm a Presbyterian. I fought this theology hammer and tongs for about 2 years. The thing that finally beat me into a corner and where I finally surrendered to it was teaching Romans. My teaching duties at the school I was teaching at every year was to teach Romans, and every year I hated Romans chapters 9, 10, and 11. You see, and I did everything I could to avoid them. Every form of higher criticism I could dream up to snip those chapters out of my Bible. But finally I got painted in a corner and finally kind of joyfully submitted. And then I had to say, well, where am I going to go to church? Well, the only place you can go if you're a true Calvinist is a Presbyterian church, friends, and that's why I'm here. So, I'm arguing for Calvinism, but I'm doing it in a friendly way. And if you don't quite see it this way, God bless you. So this is just good, clean fun. But Jesus says to Nicodemus, listen to these words, unless a man is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of heaven. Let alone enter it. You can't even see it as something to be entered unless God has already opened your eyes. Jesus says, he who has ears to hear, he who has eyes to see. Well, where do those ears come from? Where do those eyes come from to see the truth of Christ and be drawn to it so that you will not be kept from Christ? Where does that come from? Does that come out of us? Heavens no. Does it come out of some latent goodness in us? Could never be. We're dead. While we were yet dead, Paul writes, God made us alive. Not while we were sick, while we were dying, while we were doing the best we could, struggling. No, while we were dead, while we were persisting in a state of death, God made us alive. Many folks don't like that because, in my opinion, they don't like the insult that we are ultimately dependent on grace, period, for our salvation. It's nothing in me. No virtue, no running, no meriting, no laboring, no intelligence. You know, if election isn't true, then how come some of the smartest people in the world don't figure it out, and some of the rest of us do? How does that happen? How is it that you see, to the degree that you are willing to die for this truth, that Jesus is Lord, and other people, really humanly, with greater virtue, greater intelligence, greater insight, would dismiss that as so much rubbish? Why is that? My friend, the only answer I can come up with is that God has given you a gift. The gift of sight, the gift of His Spirit, the gift of a regenerate heart. And regeneration precedes faith, you see. Unless a man is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God.